Good evening, everybody. Good evening. How lovely to see so many colleagues and friends here tonight for this inaugural lecture. My name's Sarah. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor here, so it's a great privilege for me to get to do the introduction to Rory's inaugural lecture. And to those of you who are new to this campus, a very warm welcome to our Newton building. And I hope that you will all thoroughly enjoy this inaugural lecture of our new Professor of Creative Writing and Modern Literature. And tonight marks not only an important moment in Rory's career, but also a celebration, I hope, of the rich intellectual and creative life of this university. And Rory's lecture, Byard's Quantum Leaps, The Origins and Mutations of a Folktale, will be, I am sure, a fascinating exploration of folklore, literature, and the ways communities shape and preserve stories over time. Drawing on Rory's extensive research in literary recovery, research creative writing, and latterly folklore studies, he's going to guide us through the origins of the folktale that gave its name to the hamlet of Byard's Leap in Lincolnshire, and explore how historical events, migrations and social changes have influenced its transformations and endurance. And Rory's own career is distinguished by both scholarly achievement and creative excellence. Born in Belfast in 1981, raised mainly in Lincolnshire, he completed his PhD in late 20th century British poetry at the University of Leicester before joining NTU in 2012. Since then, he's become a cornerstone of our creative writing and English programmes, teaching, mentoring and supervising students across undergraduate, postgraduate and doctoral levels. He's also led the highly successful NTU MA in Creative Writing since 2013, with only 2 breaks for periods of research leave. And as a poet, a critic, an editor, Rory has made a remarkable contribution to contemporary literature. His 4 full-length poetry collections, Tonight the Summer's Over from 2013, Sarajevo Roses from 2017, Sweet Nothings from 2020, and Come Here to This Gate from 2024, have earned numerous accolades, including shortlisting for the Seamus Heaney Award and the Ledbury Forte Prize, the Poetry Book Society recommendations, recognition as BBC Poetry Extra Book of the Month, and laudatory reviews in national and other media. His critical work, including monographs and edited volumes, as well as his ongoing projects on Lincolnshire folktales and literary responses to COVID-19, demonstrate a career that bridges scholarship, creativity, and public engagement. But beyond his research and writing, Rory has also contributed more widely to the literary community. He co-edits New Walk Editions. He convenes the Nottingham Creative Writing Hub. He leads NTU's new creative practice, writing and publishing research group, and he has worked internationally as a writer in residence and a visiting lecturer, including recent appointments in South Korea to write about the demilitarized zone and in Waco, Texas. His work brings poetry, folklore, and creative writing into dialogue with communities and audiences far beyond the academy. In his spare time, Rory enjoys hiking and travelling far and near, not least to places that don't tend to get much tourist attention. When he's on leave, he might be standing at the top of a volcano in the middle of the Atlantic, or underneath a crumbling communist monument in Albania, or navigating a cave in the Dales. And then one day, he might write about this in poetry or prose. He spends more time than a grown-up should looking around old buildings and ruins, and he supports both Norwich City and Notts County football clubs, which he says normally provides an annual double dose of disappointment and helps to keep both his bank balance and his spirits down. But tonight's lecture invites us to think about the ways stories endure, they transform, and they reveal the values and identities of the communities that tell them. And in exploring Byard's Leap, we are not only learning about a local folktale, but also about the broader human impulse to shape, preserve, and pass on meaning through narrative. And it is a particular privilege to host this inaugural lecture, both as a historian, and including being a historian of medieval Lincolnshire in years gone by, and also because this is a formal recognition of Rory's contributions to NTU, to creative writing, to literature, and to the study and the celebration of folk culture. So please, everyone, and really quite a packed inaugural lecture this evening, join me in giving a warm and enthusiastic welcome to Professor Rory Waterman.
Bless you. How kind. You're not meant to laugh, though, when it's mentioned that I support Notts County and Norwich City. That was really disappointing, actually. It's quite upset me quite a lot. Thank you very much, Sarah, and my school and my former school and everyone who's turned up, family, friends, colleagues, former colleagues, students, former students. Thank you to everyone for wanting to be here. I hope you'll think it was just about worth it, and it's very special for me, so I really appreciate it. I really do. It's customary, I've got a clicker. It's customary at an inaugural lecture to begin by saying something about your life and academic journey. That's not working, so I'll just do that. That's not working either. Start assuming to go on. There we go. Is that working? There we go, there he is. Yeah, it's customary to begin by saying something about your life and academic journey. Here I am a couple of weeks ago with Lincoln Cathedral behind me and some health food in my hands, brain food. And especially to the men in the audience, I still sit like that sometimes, and it's very comfortable, and I recommend it highly to you. Here I am reading for a lecture I'm about to give to the MA. I've always been a writer, and here I am relaxing after a long day's professing. And as well as thanking my colleagues, friends, thanks especially to two people. First of all, to my mum. I couldn't be more grateful, Mum. I love you. And I note that you seem to especially like to be photographed with me when I'm in a funny hat and a cape. And thank you as well to my absolute favourite colleague, no offence to the others, Francesca Hardy, here respectively giving a lecture to yours truly. She's actually telling me we're in Kosovo and an area where landmines might not have been cleared, and she's telling me not to go down that hill. In the middle as a film scholar, and on the right as an intrepid explorer. Yeah, I'm grateful to you too, and most of my best decisions are your ideas, really, and you know that's true. She's nodding sagely. Unbelievable. So my journey. I'm quite proud of this school report from my secondary school English teacher. Rory shows great potential in English. Unfortunately, his lack of coursework and general disaffected attitude lead me to believe he will not achieve this potential. But I've really turned things around looking at the grid at the top, because these days I'm always well prepared and I'm not always well behaved. I finished school with 4 GCSEs at grade C, and before that I even managed to get expelled at one point, then allowed back in, admittedly, thanks again, Mum. I'd always been interested in things. Eventually I went to the University of Leicester and experienced the many glories of studying English. You learn about pretty much anything through literature when you study English. And it seemed like the most valuable degree of them all to me then, and it still seems like one of the most valuable, rewarding and roundly preparatory degrees that you can do. Then I went to Durham for my MA in English Studies. Then I did various jobs for a couple of years, including in the US, but nothing glamorous. I worked on a ski resort and on rentals. Then I'd made some academic or kind of gathered some academic heroes by that point. Chief among them, Professor Martin Stannard at the University of Leicester. So in 2008, I went back there to study for a PhD on late 20th century British poetry and belonging and estrangement under his guidance, and completed that in 2012, which is when I started working here at NTU as a lecturer in English and creative writing. I don't know if they're here, but Sharon Udit? Sharon here? Nah. Nah. Well, okay, so the people who interviewed me, I'm very grateful to them, but they obviously thought it was a bad idea at the time because they haven't shown up. I'm not sure there's a lesson in any of this, but it's given me empathy for people who don't think they're that good or don't think they're good enough to do much in life, because until I started to learn not to be, mainly at university while studying English, I was that person. And it's a common impediment, especially away from elite fee-paying schools and pampered backgrounds. That definitely informs why I wanted to teach, and it informs how I teach. It always will. I've got quite varied research interests. I like moving ahead by going... I left the water over there, I'll trust myself. I like moving ahead by going sideways, but I certainly never saw myself as any kind of folklorist. Then in 2021, I rewrote some Lincolnshire-based folk tales into bawdy ballads for my own amusement, and they ended up in this book, my fourth collection. And they went down very well at readings and that sort of thing. But most people, even people local to where the folk tales came from, didn't seem to know the originals generally, partly because Lincolnshire is amongst the most overlooked parts of Britain in wider national narratives. The stories associated with Lincolnshire don't tend to get shared or taken on by writers, podcasters and so on as those from more fashionable or associated with more fashionable touristed bits of the country, and it has always been thus. So I dreamed up a plan to change that, centred on reducing those inequalities, supplementing and providing quality education and community sustainability. This was the AHRC Lincolnshire Folktales Origins, Legacies, Connections, Futures project. And these are the main stakeholders and partners we worked with. The book in the middle was published last year and co-edited by the project's research fellow, Dr. Anna Millen, who's sitting over there, bottom right. Glare at her, please. And the book on the right will be out next month, published by a certain Mr. Ross Bradshaw, who's in this room somewhere, unless he's left already. Okay. Anna and I did a huge number of things, a huge number of research and engagement related things on this project. And I won't go through them all, pick a photo and concentrate on that. So despite my history primarily as a researcher of modern and contemporary literature and a writer, I wanted to focus this lecture on folklore. In it, I intend to show something about how folktales are sticky and pick up all sorts of aspects of history and culture as they travel through space and time, and how they have the propensity to go forth and multiply, then become native in different places and sometimes quickly evolve into different subspecies. But also how they're often difficult to trace because they're usually the stories historically of the non-literate. I'm going to focus on this aspect of one tale, centred on one unglamorous hamlet about 20 miles from here. And there's a lot more I could say about all of these things, all of the things I'm going to talk about, but hopefully you'll find what I do say diverting, and if you'd like to pick me up on anything at a later point, I'll welcome that. So if you drive west along the A17 from Newark to Sleaford, you'll pass a little junction on the right to the village of Ancaster. And if you turn at that junction, you'll immediately be beside the hamlet of Byard's Leap. Most of the settlement's tucked in on the right, along a cul-de-sac that used to belong to Ermine Street, one of Roman Britain's main thoroughfares. These days, a still navigable part of Ermine Street comes to an abrupt stop in the hamlet, from where the sound of unending traffic rushes past on the other side of a shield of trees. The junction that plugs Byard's Leap into the Newark to Sleaford Road, that's an entirely modern invention. As you can see here, it bends away from the Arrow Straits route of Ermine Street and joins the new bit of road. Until the 1960s, as you can see in the older maps here, travellers between east and west met two sharp bends here and had to dogleg through the hamlet on a short section of the ancient highway. But then the main road was straightened, and so for the past 60 years, motorists journeying from one town to the other have generally had no reason to know that Byard's Leap even exists. This is the hamlet on the satellite view today. And here you can see old against new. The northerly portion of Ermine Street, north of the road across now, that was effectively cut off, and it's become nothing more than a farm track and a footpath. Or to put it another way, the stretch of Ermine Street north of the hamlet has remained much as it always was, while much to the south has changed quite dramatically. This stretch of Ermine Street was a main route between Lincoln and the south of England until the 18th century, but hardly had huge footfall. Then it had even less as the main north-south route shifted to the west. In the late Victorian period, despite increased travel and increased population in the nearby towns, in the late Victorian period it remains a very lonely spot. And the Reverend J. Conway Walter in 1891 described a solitary farmhouse. You can see Byard's Leap Farm taking up a lot of the hamlet as it was, but a solitary farmhouse, its solitude only relieved by two cottages distant about 100 yards, and more recently erected a small school building. The farm is still there, built from blocks of the local Ancaster limestone. So's the more recently erected school building. You can see it behind the blue car. But these days there are about as many amenities in Byard's Leap as there are houses. There's a vehicle repair shop, a tiny campsite, and the Horseshoes Cafe and Lodge. Note the name. The few visitors to Byard's Leap might notice two small squares of gravel, some distance apart. Each of them contains a full set of horseshoes welded into place at regular intervals like the number 4 on a dice. They mark the places where a legendary horse is said to have made his final legendary bounds. At one time there were 3 sets of these horseshoes. The lost set, according to the folklorist Ethel H. Rudkin in 1936, she said they were grassed over beside a cottage on what's now the opposite side of the A17. And I've marked the probable location of that on the map with a question mark. Rudkin measures the distance between the remaining marked bounds, and she does so beautifully unscientifically rather, in her diary. She says, "I paced between the 2 sets of horseshoes and made it 58 paces," which I think is quite lovely. Now, as is common with almost any folktale that has continued to be popular for any length of time and has travelled, the story associated with these horseshoes doesn't always contain the same details. In essence, though, it's as follows, and I'm not going to tell it like a storyteller would. because a good storyteller would develop the basic frame of the story into a rip-roaring yarn which could take most of the time of the lecture. So instead I'm just going to talk you through the basic frame of the story, its main beats, before going on to discuss how it's been toyed around with and why and where it might have come from. So here goes. So this is the basic frame of the story. There's a witch called Meg, and Meg lives in a hut, or lived in a hut, or a cave here on the western side of Ermine Street, with her 2 children, and caused untold mischief to cattle, crops and local people, so they decided to do something about it. Well, the people did, the cattle and the crops didn't. A brave man undertook to do the deed, but he needed to choose a ride, so he led his horses to the local pond, and when they'd started to drink, he chucked in a rock to see which would react first and prove itself most alert. The first to do so was Byard, or Blind Byard, in some versions the hero's old warhorse, long retired and not an obvious choice. That settled it, so the next day the hero set off for Meg's hut or cave atop Byard, taking a sword with him. Arriving at her abode, he called for her, and she replied without emerging, and she said, "I'll buckle me shoes and suckle me cubs, and I'll soon be with you, me laddie," which is a bit odd. You might think that this suckling would take some time, but immediately, however, the tricksy Meg appeared, so the hero, still riding Byard, swung his sword and cut off her left breast, presumably falling slightly short of his intended target. She leapt towards him, clawing into Byard with such venom that he made 3 huge leaps back the way he'd come, the witch clinging on the whole while. At that point, the hero turned and thrust his sword right through the witch, but also accidentally through Byard. Both horse and witch died, so victory was bittersweet, but the community had been saved. So that's the story, the basic premise. No doubt you can see some problems with that. That severed breast does deserve some comment. Several versions of the tale don't include it, in some cases bowdlerising, no doubt. No extant version dwells on it or expresses the slightest sympathy for Meg at any point. Women often don't do very well in folk tales, which sort of reflects a mainstay of social history. Obviously, as the breast gets cut off immediately after she tells us she has been suckling her cubs, which might equally mean her familiars or her bestial seeming children, or could mean both, we're encouraged at that moment of jeopardy to reflect that at least her suckling will now be more difficult, that her cubs might not now grow strong enough to terrorise the neighbourhood as she had been doing. And her subsequent death is simply a triumph, because, you see, she's a witch, and at least as far as the tale is concerned, witches are repulsive, at once subhuman and superhuman. We can connect the witch and the dearth of empathy for her to the fear of maleficent, or harmful magic. This was widespread in England during the early modern period, and for a long while afterwards in rural Lincolnshire, among many other places, as demonstrated by a lot of anecdotes that have been collected. For example, Rudkin, nearly a century ago, collected the account of a Mrs. W. of Thorsway, who tells her about a witch called Nancy who bewitched a pig. Then another man got wrong side of her, and she made him ill and kept him in bed for weeks on end. So there you go. Rudkin collected hundreds of such quotations from people all over Lincolnshire and a little bit beyond. Anecdotes collected by James Alpas Penny in the 1910s include such grotesque personages as, and I quote, "the 3 notorious witches of Horncastle, said to have been active during the past 40 years. I could go much more into this sort of thing, but I'll spare you, and I'll just say that there's lots of evidence of widespread rural wariness about witches, at least well into the later 19th century, and maybe later, not least in places that are far from the madding crowd like lots of Lincolnshire. Some renditions of the tale, including Walter's from 1891, have the horse, hero and witch arrive back at the pond, where the witch, and in some instances the horse, falls in and drowns. Now, it's tempting to consider this in light of what is referred to as the swimming test, in which women accused of maleficium were once tied up and dunked in baptismal water. Sink and you're not a witch because the water has embraced you, so either you can be pulled out and be sent home, or in many cases die a noble, agonising death. Float and you are a witch because the holy water has rejected you, and you can be prosecuted accordingly. This was a common practice for much of the late 16th and 17th centuries, when up to 50,000 people in England were accused of witchcraft. Approximately 2,000 to 2,500 were executed for it, and about 90% of them were women. The swimming test was part of this. The church officially never approved of it, though King James I certainly did, and it only died out in the late 17th century when the fear of witches had abated a little bit and courts began to regard the practice as assault or murder. Which it sort of is. For a witch to be drowned in the pool, right, it would therefore not have to be holy water in any sense whatsoever, and a lot of people would have known that. Folktales tied to specific locations only really catch the local imagination when the geography backs them up. However, Ethel Rudkin was told in the 1930s that this is where a holy spring called St Helen's Well used to be. Though by the time she visited, it was locally referred to as the Muck Pool, and it had mostly dried up. For what it's worth, I found no evidence of either name on old maps or historical records, nor any evidence of a spring, and the pool has since been filled in anyway. Anyway, associations of this aspect of the story with the swimming test might explain why lots of other renditions have her die somewhere else instead. Whether intentionally or not, having her killed by means other than drowning helps to remove any doubt that she wasn't a witch. What were her evil deeds? Versions of the tale from a century or more ago are low on detail. They focus on the need without explanation and on the hero. For example, S.M. Mayhew in 1879 describes the tale's human hero as a roving bounty hunter of a sort, a knight whose mission appears to have been in delivering the earth from sorcerers. But some of the more recent renditions flesh out the testimony to leave us in no doubt that she absolutely had to be dealt with. It's not unusual for logical gaps in folktales to be filled in later renditions, sometimes quite ingeniously. You can imagine successive storytellers thinking, that doesn't make sense, how do I correct it? Or successive audiences who aren't always for a storyteller as well behaved as you lot, going, how did that happen? And explanations having to be found and added to the story. But it's also likely that more recent tellers of the tale might find it, let's say, less palatable effectively to have a bloke kill an alleged witch without providing at least some evidence for her evil. Folktales aren't fixed entities, so they can adapt with the times to survive, and tend therefore to give useful snapshots of shifting attitudes. And I'll just give you one example. In 1986, Mary Burroughs recalled a version she remembered from the mid-20th century when she was a girl, in which there's a new character. As she tells it, a farm labourer called Sill was walking home to Ancaster one evening when he fell in a stupor and then woke up and witnessed a rendezvous between the village witch Meg and her master, the devil. Sill watched as the evil pair went through the village with horns of fire and brimstone in their hands, setting alight to the growing crops and killing the beasts of the fields. So here we are unusually told she was seen being evil, and we're given details. Thereafter, this version essentially returns to the standard narrative. Burroughs' version doesn't specify where the witch lives, but when an abode is identified, it's always either a hut or a cave, very frequently a cave. And it would have been really important that local audiences of the original tale, could suspend at least some disbelief, and therefore that the few locations that it specified could be identified in the landscape. In 1825, the earliest extant source for the tale to mention a dwelling place describes a witch who punished everyone that, either from accident or curiosity, approached her cave. Now, the notion that, Meg lived in a cave might seem rather unlikely in, Lincolnshire, which tends to look like this and isn't exactly Tora Bora. But Ancaster Stone has been quarried close to here for millennia. And it's possible that some early, now lost renditions of the tale place her in a rutted stone pit on the edge of civilization, living a shadow life in the shadows of a pit. In his 1891 essay that includes the tale, Walter situates her cave in a plantation wood on the western side of Ermine Street, and suggests, you can see it on the map, and suggests that it was most likely a deserted quarry. That now cleared wood, that's visible on maps from 1950 and before. There's no historical or cartographic evidence of a quarry here, but several other pre-industrial stone pits have been found nearby, some of them ancient. The nearest known stone pits, identified by geophysical survey in 2002, were just about 150 metres northwest of the corner of this map. Obviously, they're not on any maps. That's on the western side of Ermine Street, where several versions of the tale place her dwelling, so perhaps she was once upon a time supposed to have lived there. Okay, so let's talk about the place name, tied as it is very firmly to the tale. The name Byard's Leap can be traced back to 1601 as Byard's Leap of Ancaster Heath, suggesting a version of the tale might have been in circulation then. William Stukely, who visited Byard's Leap around 1724, mentions only 4 little holes, not horseshoes, holes in the ground, about which locals tell silly stories of a witch and a horse making a prodigious leap, and that his feet rested in these holes. Stukely suggests these holes might simply indicate the boundaries of 4 parishes, in which case the legend was created subsequently to explain their existence, and the horseshoes that were subsequently added have since multiplied to reinforce it. But there's no evidence that Byard's Leap was ever at a multi-parish boundary, and moreover there is concrete evidence from before Stukely's visit that there were already at least 2 sets of holes far enough apart to indicate a gigantic bound, and therefore obviously not at all likely to have comprised between them 1 set of 4 boundary markers. Stukely just didn't notice one of the sets of holes, and his rational, or somewhat rational, enlightened mind was just trying to spoil everyone else's fun. The earliest extant account of the story in print, so this is the earliest extant account of the story in print, it's included in an anonymous travelogue, allegedly written in 1704, but not published until 1818, so who knows. The traveller reports that on Lincoln Heath is the mark of a horse's leap being 16 yards. The horse's name was Byard, and this place is called Byard's Leap from him. The horse was frightened by a witch, and the people hereabouts keep the mark of the leap on purpose to be seen. 2 things of note here. First of all, Byard's singular leap seems to have become Byard's multiple leaps sometime between the early 18th century and the late 19th, because neither Stukely nor the anonymous 1704 author mentions more than one leap, or anything, or more than two sets of holes, and the hamlet's name has always been singular, it's always been Byard's leap. We know there were three sets of horseshoes in the late 19th century, and of course that would make sense as three leaps if the final leap ended in the pool, take off 1 to 2, second leap 2 to 3, next leap 3 to plop in the pool or whatever. Right. Secondly, you might have noticed that the significant disparity between the lengths of leaps, or the apparent lengths of leaps, in different accounts that measure them. So Rudkin talks about 58 paces between the two sets of remaining horseshoes in 1931. They'd have needed to be paces of less than 10 inches if they'd only took her 60 yards, and 16 yards, and Ethel Rudkin was a person, not a corgi. I think. Writing in 1891, only 4 decades before Rudkin passed through, Walter, Reverend J. Conway Walter, measured the distance between sets of horseshoes at 20 paces, which is again roughly 16 yards. Nothing like Rudkin, less than 40 years later. You'll be glad to know that, intrepid explorer that I am, and researcher that I am, I also measured the distance between the horseshoes in my own beautifully social science sort of way, paced between them, and found it to be 57 paces, which is one fewer than Ethel Rudkin, which means they're probably about the same distance apart, because I'm probably lankier than she is, About the same, in other words. So it seems that the horseshoes were added to the holes to mark Byard's big leaps sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and then that they were moved much farther apart, specifically between 1891 and 1931. As the tale grew taller over time, its theatre of action grew longer. It's likely that the shoes were relocated to increase their curiosity value at a time of increased population and traffic in the area, with the aim of encouraging travellers to stop when passing through what was otherwise barren country, like roadside attractions in often quite barren parts of the United States. Here are some contemporary examples. That's Carhenge in Alliance, Nebraska, well worth a visit. The world's largest teapot, which is a banger. This elephant with a window in its bum in New Jersey, and this big dinosaur, I can't remember where it is, who cares. We know there were some outlets around Byard's Leap a century ago. A garage, for example. Ethel Rudkin mentions them in her account of being there. In an age before motor cars, curiosity value would do. Size wasn't so important, and now they're just relics down a cul-de-sac. A quick side note. When I talked to Anna briefly about a patrapeic symbol, she said, don't talk about witch marks, and I was like, don't worry, I'm not going to do that. You don't call them that. Right. This is never mentioned in any version of the Byard's Leap tale, but horseshoes once served an patrapeic function, which means they were used to ward off evil. And little side note, I recently was asked to do a workshop for, let's say, largely a group of pensioners who wanted to make witch bottles and wanted to know what goes inside them. You need lashings of wee, and so, some weird craft afternoon they had, I hope. Anyway, yeah, so they once served an patrapeic function used to ward off evil. Horseshoes were commonly placed at thresholds, in Lincolnshire and some other places, with prongs facing up, symbolically to catch evil in the bowl. They were also used to stop evil returning. So in Paisley in Scotland, the location where several alleged witches' burned bodies were interred was marked with a horseshoe, now replaced with this horseshoe memorial you can see on the right. But nothing indicates the horseshoes at Byard's Leap were initially placed there with a patrapeic intention. They primarily just represent a good horse. but they also represent, generally, perhaps inadvertently, the repelling of evil. They at least add to the notion that the horse responsible for them has seen off a witch and protected people thereabouts from all evil. Okay, so let's move on to consider how Byard got his name. Walter, in 1891, suggests that the sobriquet Byard was doubtless derived, he says, from the French warrior Le Chevalier de Byard, who died in 1524. But Byard's the name of the Byard's Leap horse, not the rider, so he's wrong. You have to put up with a lot of terrible scholarship, amateur scholarship, when you investigate folklore. There's a much likelier explanation indicated on the slide. A horse called Byard appears in medieval French chansons de geste, or songs of heroism, and in one of those, the Four Sons of Aymon, the earliest extant version of which was written in the late 12th century, he's a magical bay horse gifted to the hero, Renaud. It's pronounced something like that. I don't speak French, can you tell? One of the eponymous Four Sons, anyway, is gifted the horse. This Byard is, among other things, extremely strong. He carries all four sons on his back simultaneously. He has kind of like an expandable, contractible back. He can understand human speech. He's strong and powerful and clever. His end nearly comes when he's captured by Charlemagne, the antagonist, attached to a weight, in some versions a millstone around his neck, though not on the illustration here, and chucked into the River Meuse. You'll be glad to know he then escapes and lives in the forest. But the similarities are obvious. The pool of the Byard's Leap legends, the Muck Pool, as it is in, when Rudkin was there, that stands in for one of Europe's grand rivers, and the witch is the metaphorical millstone. The story made its way around Europe in multiple renditions and arrived in England in the 13th century. Caxton then printed a version in 1489, and that was reprinted for centuries. It's almost inconceivable that the Byard's Leap story developed wholly independently of that. The Ardennes contains the greatest concentration of sites associated with that heroic tale. These four crags break the forest canopy like subtle fins, and they're said to represent the four suns atop Byard as it leaps over the valley. Which is a feat that would render the Lincolnshire Byard's two-person bound a kind of Lilliputian hop, right? Just south of Dinant, on the Belgian side, you'll find this huge crag purported to have been cleft from the valley wall by mighty Byard during the same flight. In England, good old England, right? The only rock attributed in the sense to a horse called Byard is a forgotten mount half buried in the verge outside Byard's Leap Farm, with Byard's Leap across it in heavily weathered, recessed lettering. And perhaps the inconspicuousness of this rock is fitting. Most references to a Byard in late medieval or an early modern English text present something very different to the super equine steed of the Four Sons of Aymon. Chaucer, in one of several late medieval examples, makes reference to Byard the blind that blundereth forth and peril casteth noon. So Byard that blunders forth and knows no peril. Other examples are included by John Gower, Thomas More, and several others. And it's probable that the original tellers of the Byard's Leap tale had this less ostentatious sort of horse in mind, at least as much as the horse of the Four Sons. So the Byard's Leap tale is apparently the ungainly, brutish offspring of the Four Sons of Aymon and the less ostentatiously impressive Byard of late medieval English narratives. But what else? What else might have fed into the tale's development? What local ingredients might it have? I'm going to talk now about something historically verifiable. This is about the alleged beaver witches of Beaver. There were 3 servants at Beaver Castle, a mother called Joan and her 2 daughters called Margaret and Philippa, or Philip, who in 1618 were victims of the most famous witch trial in this part of the country. The three women were accused of bewitching two child brothers who were heirs to the Earl of Rutland, both of whom had fallen ill and died. The map panel, the middle panel, the satellite view panel, shows something approximating the route they almost certainly took to trial in Lincoln. Joan, the mother, died at Ancaster on the way to trial. She allegedly requested bread, saying that if she was guilty it would choke her, and then it did, which was taken as evidence, further incriminating the daughters, who confessed and were hanged at Lincoln Castle. And this, of course, as the old adage has it, really is a history told by the powerful, often now repeated as fact, including by plenty of academic sources, or in plenty of academic sources. And Anna Millen, again, has a forthcoming essay about that, which goes into much more detail. So if you want to ask questions about that, interrogate her and leave me alone. In the parish church at Bottersford, near Beaver, this commemorative monument to the Earl and Countess notes that they had two sons, both which died in their infancy by wicked practice and sorcery. It's the only allusion to these women on any monument anywhere. The naming of Byard's Leap predates these events, but it's surely possible that the legend associated with Joan Flowers, who died just south of what's now Byard's Leap, and whose daughters passed Byard's Leap on the way to trial and execution, inspired the inclusion of Meg in the Byard's Leap legend. Or that Joan's local death may at least have had a preservatory effect on the story. This was, we know, big news locally. It was captured, for example, in a popular pamphlet in 1619 and a ballad in 1620. The Byard's Leap story itself has travelled. Ethel Rudkin, 1936, notes that the tale is very widely known and that she's heard versions from Willerton and Burnham Marsh and other remote places, and that it's always hearsay, never book knowledge. Those versions are now lost because she didn't record them and nobody else did either, but it's likely that they existed, that they were versions of the same story, and that they also all differed substantially from one another, sometimes to bring in local features and personalities, because that's true of a lot of the versions that do survive in printed sources. For example, Sidney Oldall Oddie's, Oddie, that's right. His printed rendition from 1895 appropriates the narrative for a different part of the county. Near Market Raisin, he writes, there once lived a witch who was a great trouble to the farmers of the neighbourhood. And the tale he then tells is fundamentally the same as the usual story, but very locally focused in places. Much closer to Byard's Leap, about 10 miles away, is Dunstan. This village, or at least the stream or beck that flows through it, is the only named location in a folk tale that's never been connected to the Byard's Leap legends, but which I think is clearly another variation of the same tale. It exists in one printed source, Linden Lays and Legends by Edward George Kent, 1861. Kent calls it Billy Shuffler and the Lincolnshire Witches, and as Kent's is the only source of the tale, it's possibly made it up, or that it was never told orally at all. But either way, it's too full of similarities to the Byard's Leap story not to have been influenced by that, either because Kent was, or because it was adapted to a different environment. It includes a cave lived in by witches, and a flight from those witches on an unlikely horse, this time called Old Simon, who dies a hero. His rider is the hapless gardener Billy Shuffler, so that's a bit different and a bit classist as well in the framing that Kent gives it. Well, very actually. The story finds Old Simon bounding home from a witch's cave with the eponymous Billy Shuffler on his back and a witch clutching into the horses behind, exactly as we find in the Byard's Leap story, until he came to Dunstan Beck, where he bounded o'er the stream. Old Simon, wearied with the chase, fell backwards in the flood. Like Byard, he makes a big leap, but here not quite big enough, and that's why he meets his fate. And it's not the news, but perhaps it's less ignominious than something called the muck pool. I interviewed people in Dunstan in spring 2024 and found precisely nobody who'd heard of Billy Shuffler and the Lincolnshire Witches. It's also not included in any modern compendia of folklore. But in autumn 2024, with Adverse Camber Productions as part of the Lincolnshire Folktales project, we ran a week-long workshop at Dunstan Primary School, the first school I attended, as part of a series of story-making weeks in schools. The lead storyteller, Pin Stockman, I don't know if Pin here? Nah. Yeah, she is. Hello, Pin. Pin is available in duplicate in this room because she's in the bottom right-hand corner and she's also up there. Glare at her as well. So the lead storyteller, Pin, over there, who's brilliant, worked with the kids to choose a local folk tale, to work on an original story that made use of it and to then perform it for the rest of the school. This is my ticket. Tickets to Billy Shuffler. Tickets to Billy Shuffler. The kids at Dunstan selected Billy Shuffler, excited that it mentions their little village. Intriguingly, they then chose to bring in specific local details that enriched the narrative for them and for other locals, but which would have meant very little to anybody else. The abandoned RAF hospital a mile away, for example, which you're really not meant to go in. Andy's nodding because we have wandered around it, haven't we? Why the kids are going there and their parents would be terrified. Anyway, that and the neighbouring estate village of Nocton. These details became significant to their plot. And in the picture in the top right, you can see that they're representing the very different houses in Nocton and Dunstan, respectively. And they're favouring their village. Fair enough. And somehow, if the story of Byard's Leap hadn't come about, and before that, if the story of the four sons of Aemon hadn't been devised on another landmass almost a millennium ago, and we could go further back than that and to different places than that as well, the admittedly very different story devised by these kids, wasn't it, Pin? Very different story devised by these kids in my old primary school would not have existed either. And that seems like a nice thing to end on, so that's what I'll do. Thank you. Thanks, Dan. Thank you.
God, what an act to follow. Colleagues, friends, guests, good evening. My name is Dara, and it is my pleasure as Dean of the school and on behalf of Angela Brown, Rory's former Dean, to offer a vote of thanks to Professor Rory Waterman after what I think we can all agree was just a truly mesmerising inaugural lecture. Rory, trying to condense a career, a passion, showcasing your research into a single hour, all while keeping a very diverse group of academics, of friends, of students, of family equally engaged, is no small task. But I think we can all agree that you managed it with clarity, with heart, and with the kind of thoughtful curiosity that has always been characteristic of your work. This evening didn't just showcase the intellectual rigour of your field, it showcased you, your values, your humour, your commitment to creativity. And in true Rory style, you did this all with the perfect balance of insight and levity. You've given us much to think about, and I'm sure for many of us, places to go that are not too far away. It also falls to me to extend a number of thanks on Rory's behalf, many of which you've already expressed, but you have woven through so thoughtfully into the lecture. But to reiterate, firstly, and most importantly, Rory would like to reiterate his heartfelt thanks and deep gratitude to the many special people who have supported him to get to where he is today. To his family, to his friends, to his colleagues and former colleagues. And these are his words: your encouragement, your belief, your patience and your presence have shaped my academic journey. Whether you've offered intellectual challenge, a listening ear, a nudge of motivation, or simply shown up when it mattered, Rory wants you to know how profoundly he appreciates it. As a school, and now the School of Social Sciences, which includes arts and humanities, we are incredibly proud to have Rory among us. His work reflects the best of what we stand for: intellectual ambition, a commitment to creativity, and work that celebrates our communities and our heritage. Tonight has been a celebration not only of your work, but of you and the contributions that you make to the university. And so now, in time-honoured NTU fashion, it is my pleasure to invite all of you to join us for refreshments, conversation, and the opportunity to continue the fascinating discussions sparked this evening. Please do stay, mingle, and help us celebrate Rory's achievements and the exciting trajectory ahead of it. But before we do that, I would ask you all to join me in one final warm and rapturous round of applause for Professor Rory.
Can we have a soft drink? And then hold on.